today we will learn about the topic the post-colonial period in India, which is a part of the environmental history of India. First, we will go through the objective of our lecture, which are to understand the concept of environment and its relation to human beings. Secondly, to study the changes in various environmental acts over a gradual period of time. And thirdly, to study the various kinds of environmental policies and laws in the post-colonial India. So what is environment? Environment is a broad term which encompasses all natural things that surrounds us and is essential to sustain life, such as air, which is atmosphere, water, that is hydrosphere, land, lithosphere, flora, fauna, etc. And environmental history is the study of human interaction with the natural world. So how can we define in a broad spectrum what is environmental history? Environmental history shares a very messy border with economic and social histories, history of science and technology, disease history, and even with various other disciplines. The principal goal of environmental history is to deepen our understanding of how human beings have been affected by the natural environment and also how they have affected the environment and with what result and consequences. So what is the role of environment in the historical development of India? Environment played an important role in the process of the historical developments, good or bad condition of any period or of any country, primarily linked with the favorable or unfavorable environmental condition of that period or country. The history of nation and evolution of culture and civilization have greatly been influenced by environmental features because human society, like any other living organism, tries to adapt itself to natural environment. Nature not only provided man with shelter and food, but also played a significant role in the making of mankind. Ever since man emerged on the earth, there had been persistent dependency on nature. In the early stage of his emergence, man was quite helpless in nature. Even in the modern times, in spite of outstanding progress and attempt of science to control nature and environment, human beings are unable to subdue it. Rather, they are greatly controlled and influenced by the natural phenomenon. Natural resources available on this earth, however, have their limits, over-exploitation of which leads to environmental crisis in some form or the other. Now, what are the environmental crises? Although environment is now facing a number of crises because of the following reasons. Firstly, all the natural resources available on the earth have their limits, over-exploitation of which leads to environmental crisis in some form or the other. Environment, in fact, is at a very dangerous stage and polluted owing to different causes, mainly of man-made. The most pertinent need of the hour is to protection, conservation, and proper use. Otherwise, the living world will be endangered into inevitable dangers. Man has to adapt to nature and not vice versa. The UN Conference of Human Environment in Stockholm was held in 1972 in order to draw attention of the world to the imminent global catastrophe due to pollution of environment and depletion of natural resources. Stockholm Declaration, in fact, was a major step taken by the world powers towards the preservation, protection, and improvement of the environment. The Indian government, through constitution and by the implication of law, passing a number of acts, tried to protect the environment. Now, India is a large country with a high population density. it is a developing country with comparatively low per capita income and a recent legacy of colonial rule. It is a strong, vibrant, multi-party democracy with an independent judiciary and open media. The conflict between conservation of the environment and the socio-economic growth has been much debated and discussed. It is generally postulated that a thrust for preservation of the environment imposes costs that a developing country is unwilling to bear. The environmental Kuznets curve framework is a postulate which has a relationship, an inverted U-shaped relationship between environmental pollution and per capita income. It argues that the inverted U relationship is a combination of three factors: the scale effect, which suggests an increase in pollution when an economy grows; the composition effect, referring to structural changes in the economy consequent to growth over years, and its long-term environmental effects; and the technology effect, which is a reduction in emission due to technological advances from long-term growth. India's post-independence environmental policy making journey can be segregated into 5 parts for the ease of understanding. The first is the period from 1947 to 1970, which we term as the initial years that saw the promulgation of the National Forest Policy of 1952. The second is the period from 1970 to 1990, when, backed by a strong political commitment, the foundation of India's environmental policy and legal framework was laid. This period also witnessed the emergence of several people's movements born out of conflict over the usage and control of natural resources. The third period was the decade of 1990 to 2000 that saw the emergence of the participatory approaches and a collaborative partnership with the civil society in natural resource management and a proactive judiciary addressing pressing environmental issues. The fourth part is the period from 2000 to 2010 that saw the advent of right-based approaches. The fifth part is the period from 2010 to 2020, which we refer to as the decade of standoffs between a strong state and a resilient civil society. In the following sections, we discuss the key milestones in India's environmental policy journey and will also explore the influencing factors. Now, we first come to the forest policy. In the first few decades after independence, India did not have comprehensive environmental laws, barring a few such as the Indian Forest Act of 1927 and the Factories Act of 1948. Although some laws touched upon the issues of pollution, they had limited territorial reach and were largely unsuccessful in their enforcement. This period saw the promulgation of the National Forest Policy in 1952 that proposed to increase the national forest cover to 1/3 of the geographical area of the country to check land degradation. It also highlighted the need to meet the growing needs of the local community for grazing, firewood, and agricultural implements, but not at the cost of national interest. It cautioned against the practice of relinquishment of forest land for agricultural purposes by acknowledging the role forests play in provisioning fuel and timber and in protecting against dust storms, hot desiccating winds, and erosion. However, during this period, environmental issues were only occasionally mentioned or explored in the development plan as food security, poverty alleviation, agriculture development, and national security were at the forefront of India's developmental policy. There remained a gap between policy intent, and the practice in these initial decades after independence, resulting in a continued degradation of the country's natural capital. So, since we have learnt about initial objectives of our lecture, we will go for the first quiz. When was the National Forest Policy promulgated? The options are A. 1947, B. 1952, C. 1950, and D. 1951. Yes, and the answer is 1952. Now we come to the international environmental diplomacy. The United Nations Conference on Human Environment marked a milestone in the evolution of environmental policymaking in India. The Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was the only head of the government to address the conference in Stockholm other than the Swedish Prime Minister. The Government of India embraced the declaratory principles of the UN conference wholeheartedly and refashioned environmental policy through a flurry of legislative and administrative activity. The Wildlife Protection Act, passed by the Parliament in September 1972, was the first in a series of such legislation. The Act continues to form the cornerstone for wildlife conservation efforts. Hunting or destruction of species described in the schedule to the Act was outlawed. A licensing procedure for game hunting of permitted species was set out. Mechanism for declaration of sanctuary and national parks for protection of wildlife living in the designated area was specified with elaborate machinery for enforcement. In the early 1970s, when India's forest and wildlife were being overexploited, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi laid the foundation for protecting the country's forest and wildlife. Her strong political commitment resulted in the enactment of stringent forest and wildlife laws and the creation of an extensive protected area network for biodiversity conservation. During her regime, the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 was enacted to establish protected areas and ban wildlife hunting. In 1973, Project Tiger was launched, a flagship program that established Tiger Reserve by setting aside large forest areas in varied ecosystems. Another noteworthy driver that influenced and shaped the environmental policy space in India was the Indian environmental movement, an umbrella term that includes a multitude of nature-based local conflicts, initiatives, and struggles. The emergence of the movement can be traced back to the Chipko movement in the 1970s, often hailed as a trailblazer for several contemporary environmental movements in India. There are conflicts in defense of community rights over forest resources, fishery resources, conflict over hydropower projects, to name a few. These movements, characterized as the environmentalism of the poor, revolved around and were rooted in the environmentally unsustainable process of development and its impact on the resource rights and livelihood of the marginalized communities. These movements were built upon the work and campaign of the civil society. Next, we come to the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, which was passed in 1974. This legislation was enacted by the appropriation of states' lawmaking power on the subject of water by Parliament. Pollution of water body and the discharge of industrial effluent was sought to be prevented through the law. The Act was comprehensive in its coverage of water body to include rivers, streams, sea, tidal water, wells, and inland water bodies, whether natural or artificial. The Central Pollution Control Board was created along with the State Board for granting permission and enforcement. No industry operation or process and no treatment and disposal of effluent or sewage could be established without obtaining a consent order from the concerned board. The board was empowered to set standards for desirable levels of discharge and specify conditions for the release of effluents. After that, we come to the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. That was passed in 1981 and was the next piece of legislation to emerge. The Air Act referred to the agenda of the UN conference in Stockholm in its preamble and expressed the necessity to implement the decisions taken at the conference. The Act defined air pollutant to mean any solid, liquid, or gaseous substance, including noise present in concentrations sufficient to be injurious to human health. As wide a definition as could be required to deal with any eventuality. The pollution control boards were vested with the same power under the Air Act for prevention, control, and enforcement of mitigation measures for air pollution as was rendered to them under the Water Act in relation to water pollution. Next, we come to the Bhopal gas tragedy. In the early hour of December 3, 1984, poisonous methyl isocyanate gas from the Bhopal plant of Union Carbide India Limited was released into the atmosphere. It led to the death of thousands of people. The public clamor from the Bhopal gas tragedy forced the policy action from government. The Environment Protection Act 1986 was passed by the Parliament with extraordinary rapidity, with the time duration between the introduction of the bill in Parliament to its passage by both Houses of Parliament and its assent by the President spanning just 16 days. Next, we come to the Environment Protection Act. The Environment Protection Act gave extensive power to the central government, arrogating to it the power to set environmental standards, granting environmental clearance for all kinds of industries and activities, laying down safeguards for prevention of accidents, and notifying enforcement authorities. The state's role in environment policy was greatly diminished through the state pollution control boards continued to remain the notified enforcement authority by virtue of subordinate legislation under the Act. The Environment Protection Act, along with the Water Act and the Air Act, constituted the triad of laws that regulated the environmental pollution and abatement measures. Two other legislations emerged from the ashes of the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Processing of Claims Act 1985 and the Public Liability Insurance Act 1991. Next, we come to the Coastal Regulation Zone. The central government in 1991 hereby declares the coastal stretches of sea, bays, estuaries, creek, rivers, and backwaters, which are influenced by tidal actions in the landward side up to 500 meter from the high tide line and the land between the low tide line and high tide line as the Coastal Regulation Zone. The notification imposes restrictions on the setting up and expansion of industries, operations or processes, etc. in the said Coastal Regulation Zone. The National Green Tribunal was constituted as per the National Green Tribunal Act in 2010 as per the recommendation of the Supreme Court Law Commission and India's environmental law obligations as a specialized judicial body to adjudicate environmental cases in the country. It has original jurisdiction, appellate authority, and scientific backing for speedy and effective delivery of environmental justice. Keeping with its original mandate for speedy environmental justice, the National Green Tribunal not only put in place an effective redressal mechanism, but also proactively took up suo motu cognizance of high-profile environmental issues. Disasters and crises too have played a role in forging India's environmental policy. The Environment Protection Act 1986 was enacted in the wake of the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, the worst man-made industrial disaster. India faced some of its most severe natural calamities like the Orissa supercyclone in 1999, Gujarat earthquake in 2001, and Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. This succession of events and the international policy environment led to the enactment of the Disaster Management Act 2005. Similarly, the Tiger Task Force was set up because of a crisis when Sariska Tiger Reserve lost all its tiger and the edifice of the Project Tiger was shaking. Now we will learn about the climate policy and diplomacy. The domestic climate policy since 2007 espoused the co-benefits approach. It was based on the principle of both equity and sustainable development and aimed to align the climate change policy with development objectives. In 2008, the National Action Plan on Climate Change was launched, comprising of 8 missions covering a range of plan on renewable energy, energy efficiency, afforestation programs, which are to name a few. This period also witnessed an active political engagement with climate science and led to the thickening of institutional linkages and coordination between different ministries for effective climate governance. In 2014, for explicit focus on climate change, the Environmental Ministry was re-christened as the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. India's ratification of the Paris Agreement of 2015 marked the emergence of a third stance emphasizing the effective climate regime that aimed at linking the domestic co-benefits approach with the global climate regime. Now, with this, we come to our second quiz. In which year the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act was passed? Options are Option A, 1981, Option B, 1980, Option C, 1987, and Option D, 1984. Yes, and the correct option is 1981. So in this lecture, what we have studied is about the different environmental laws, policies, and acts that have been passed from 1947 till 2020. We have slowly improved our environment with the help of these laws. Although initially it was mainly concerned with the Forest Policy Act and not much was done about the environment after the initial post-colonial period. However, with the gradual time, different laws have been passed to protect the air, water, and different biosphere of our environment so as to help the growth of the country. Thank you.